Hello, everyone. I am Song-Chul Kim from the IPUS of Seoul National University. Today, we will carry out the session on inclusive partnership for the Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus on the Korean Peninsula. We had two typhoons in a row that led to natural disasters in Korea, but the impact was more severely felt in North Korea, and Kim Jong-un is leading the recovery work. Due to nuclearization of North Korea, there are sanctions carried out, and amidst this situation, how can we carry out humanitarian aid? This is an issue that was a problem for us continuously, and at this time, humanitarian development is all the more important. But humanitarian development should not just be about aid. We need to enable it to lead to lasting peace and sustainable development. Support and development should not be just about development of our nation. It should lead to growth and development, and also development of human capital in order to meet the requirements of lasting peace. As we can see from the panel description, this is about the triple nexus of humanitarian development, peace on the Korean Peninsula. We are trying to combine the situation on the Korean Peninsula with the international standards and norms. Today, we have brought with us three presenters that are experts in this area, and also three discussants. I would like to briefly introduce the presenters and discussants to you. Visiting Professor of Korea Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, Kadri Juan Ahan, and he has studied in international diplomacy and Korean diplomacy and quality and quantity. He is the editor, co-editor, and he is also the associate editor for quality and quantity and the Journal of Contemporary Eastern Asian Journals. He will be presenting in English today, and the second presentation will be provided by Professor Hyunyun Moon, and he is on the International Cooperation Committee, and he plays very important roles in major academies in Korea. Starting from 2016, he has been serving as a professor at Jeonbuk National University, and Song Young-eun, the professor of Gangwon University, was to give his presentation today. However, due to a urgent situation arising at his university, which he has explained to me, and that I cannot share with you today, on behalf of Professor Song, Hyun-Seok Chung will be giving the presentation on behalf of Professor Song. Dr. Chung will be presenting. And for the discussion, we have three discussants. Dr. Kyubin Che. Kyubin Che is a senior researcher at the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. He received his MA in International Development, and also he has worked on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Broader International Relations of the Asia-Pacific. And next to Jong-hyun Cho, he's a professor at Korea University, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies at Law School, and he is advising the Ministry of Unification, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Trade, Industry, Energy, and the Human Rights Commission of Korea. Last, Tae-gyun Kim. He's a professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at SNU. He is the vice dean of the graduate school, and he received his doctor's degree from Oxford. And also, he is working as advisors at UNDP and also consultant for UNESCO. And currently, he's executive director at the KOICA, and he is an editor for the Asian Journal of Peace Building. Then we would like to first allow the speakers to give a presentation for 15 to 20 minutes. We will bring up Professor Hyunyun.
안녕하세요. 저는
Good afternoon. I'm going to deliver my presentation in English. So I'm going to switch to English now.
Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see it all right? Okay, so this is from a paper that is currently under review. We just submitted our revisions, so we are still expecting to hear from the journal. We just submitted it last week, I think. It's about people-to-people diplomacy between two Koreas, although the term diplomacy may be controversial since from the South Korean perspective, it's not really a different country. It's more or less domestic politics. Leaving aside that part, in this paper, what we try to do is we try to evaluate the process of inter-Korean people-to-people exchanges by mapping South Korean government's theory of change regarding these exchanges. In order to do this, we did some archival research, or we looked at, rather than archives, we looked at primary sources, government official documents, and also we did some semi-structured interviews with current and former Ministry of Unification bureaucrats. In the second part, we explore the outcomes of inter-Korean people-to-people exchanges from the perspectives of South Korean participants. And again, for that part, also we did some semi-structured interviews with these activists. I don't think I really need to go through the background. You all know the background better than me. You were here. I wasn't even here in, I don't know, like late 80s, for example, or early 1990s. In this paper, the most important premise is that actors who enter into social interaction rarely emerge the same. So South Korean and North Korean people, when they interact with one another, they don't emerge the same after the interaction, especially if these interactions happen at a positive environment and if they are repetitive. So we look at these social and cultural exchanges, and the definition of social and cultural exchanges according to the Ministry of Unification are those related to sports, the arts, religion, youth exchanges, women organizations. So there are three kinds of people-to-people exchanges according to Ministry of Unification. So one of them is Kaesong Industrial Complex, the other one is humanitarian aid, and the third one is social and cultural exchanges. So within this broad framework of people-to-people exchanges, we focus only on social and cultural exchanges because it's the people-to-people exchanges between two Koreas where they have more or less equal status to participate. In Kaesong, the status is not that equal. South Korean people there are bosses, for example. North Korean people are the laborers, and the communication between them is rather limited. And in the case of humanitarian aid, again, South Koreans are givers, North Koreans are takers, and again, the communication between people from two parts of the peninsula is quite limited. But here, there is more or less equal status to participate and some sort of meaningful communication. So we looked at South Korean official documents, especially unification white papers and presidential speeches to figure out what South Korea's theory of change regarding these exchanges. Why should South Korea have these exchanges? And we look at four things in this theory of change, beginning with problem framing. So what's the problem that these exchanges can help solving? So it was quite consistent in different unification white papers. The main problem is alienation and antagonism over decades. So two Koreas, because of the division, got alienated from one another and grow antagonistic against each other. And very much related, the current status quo with this alienation and antagonism is unsustainable and it's unstable. So we then look at how is intervention framed. So how can South Korea address this problem according to the government? So the main idea was we should have people-to-people exchanges because it can help expanding points of contact between the two societies, because there is virtually no contact between them. And of course, there was also a legal background to it because of the, for example, national security law in South Korea and even more, much more stricter rules and laws in North Korea. These exchanges are less costly and they are less risky. So there isn't much investment costs. And they will help fill a vacuum. So South Korea cannot just go to North Korea and open a cultural center or organize activities very much like South Korea does in Japan, in China, in other countries. So there was a vacuum, and these social and cultural exchanges could fill this vacuum to some extent. In a way, supplement government's North Korea policies, especially engagement-related policies. But I'll come to that later. In the third part of theory of change, we look at intervention methods. Okay, we will do this intervention, we will do people-to-people exchanges, but what kind of methods do we have to use? Especially under progressive governments of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, reciprocity and mutuality were very much emphasized. Win-win, even in Korean, the term win-win was used quite a lot in unification white papers as well as presidential speeches. The exchanges were to be non-political as much as possible, and they should be dealing with non-contentious issues. And more importantly, this should happen at the grassroots level. So the government involvement should be minimal. So South Korean people should be meeting people from North Korea. So both sides should be from the grassroots. And fourth, what are the expected or intended outcomes of these programs? So again, especially under progressive governments, the emphasis, but also under conservative governments, the main idea was that it would help create or facilitate mutual understanding between the two Koreas or Koreans of two sides. It would also create some positive externalities by reducing tensions that is happening, especially at the security issue area between the two countries or between the two societies. And also the unification red apple. So this is also related to unification because it can help creation of a sense of belonging in the same community. So in a way, decategorizing South Korean and North Korean identities and recategorizing them within the same Korean identity, which could help conflict resolution at later stages when the unification arrives. So I talked very briefly about progressive and conservative governments, but it's not our focus in this paper. Actually, we have another paper that's also under review where we discuss how ideas matter in South Korea's North Korea policies. So ideas and ideologies are quite different between progressive and conservative governments when it comes to North Korea policies. It's kind of like the dividing line. And we see this also here in social and cultural exchanges. If you look at the numbers, so before Kim Dae-jung, although it's not clear here, there were only 3 social and cultural exchange projects that were approved by the government. So these exchanges were vitalized under Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, only to be halted by the governments of Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. So only recently they were again restarted by Moon Jae-in government, but again not to a great deal because of the sanctions against North Korea. But this is not our focus in this paper. We look at rhetoric in this paper. And the rhetoric, the theory of change of South Korean governments is quite similar under both progressive and conservative governments. So the conservative governments do not claim otherwise. They have similar ideas, at least in rhetoric, regarding these exchanges. But of course, the behavior, the outcome is quite different, as we can see in these numbers. So the second part of our article, we look at, okay, what may be the outcomes of these exchanges. So this here is more exploratory. So we look at what people think are the outcomes are, the South Korean activists who participated in these exchanges over the years. So we interviewed people who have been quite active, especially last decade or before last decade in these exchanges. So we identified some themes in these interviews. One of them is dynamics and outcomes of people-to-people exchanges. So most of our participants, South Korean participants, talked about the differences between South and North Koreans who participate in these exchanges. Whereas South Korean people were much more freer, flexible, and the demand to participate in these exchanges comes from bottom up. So they wanted to participate in these exchanges. They were quite active or proactive in that manner. But the North Korean participants were quite controlled. There were red tapes that they cannot cross, and it seemed to them that they were asked to participate in these exchanges rather than demanding to participate in these exchanges in most cases. And South Korean bureaucrats from Ministry of Unification told us that North Korea wanted to take things slow, especially under Roh Moo-hyun government. Things got quite intense with these exchanges. South Korea demanded more and more exchanges, but North Korea was kind of reluctant because, okay, this is too much. We cannot handle all this demand. South Korean participants again talked about prejudices and tensions initially, again, because of no prior contact with North Koreans, but having only mediated communication about North Korea. However, iterative, direct, and interpersonal communications helped build trust. They talked about intimacy, familiarity, and friendship, tearing down walls between them. And this is again a quotation from one of the interviews, meeting very often is the most important. And one of the interesting findings is that some participants talked about moderation of extreme views. So when progressives met North Koreans, they were like, yeah, we are comrades, you know, we have similar ideas, only to the amusement of North Koreans. We are not comrades. You and I, we are different. We are not like that. So it kind of moderated the extreme progressive views towards North Korea. And there were also some conservatives who were much more prejudiced against North Koreans, again, moderated through the experiential communication with them. And many of our participants talked about empathy, creating empathy towards North Korea after their exchanges with North Koreans. And some of them talked about scary power of freedom when especially North Koreans come to South Korea, meet them in South Korea, or when South Koreans go to North Korea and feel quite relaxed, and free, not having red tapes, for example. So they have eyes, they have ears, so they might have felt it, was the comment by some of our participants. One of the most important things that came out in our interviews was the significance of informal exchanges. So they both loved drinking, and they could have sincere and intimate dialogue over drinks, which helped them realize they are same human beings. 똑같은 사람이다, same as us. 우리랑 똑같다, similar anxieties. So if you see the word cloud in the background, it's the word cloud of our interviews regarding this part. 고민이 똑같다. So we have similar family problems, we have similar anxieties. So we are just same human beings. So it helps realization of commonalities and building of affection. On top of everything else, language, culture, and physiognomy similarities, because the two peoples are the same, Koreans, helped eliciting more positive feelings. So many people talked about being same blood, same race, same family, and compatriots. So this is in a way helping, as I said earlier, decategorizing South and North Korean identities and recategorizing it as a superordinate Korean identity. And again, this is just an exploration, but can this psychological state be sustained? So we are now working on this. We just got a new grant to test this hypothesis. It will be very difficult, of course, because we cannot really bring South and North Koreans together and do a lab experiment, but we will do some proxies to see if the psychological state of recategorization of identity can be sustained. And many of them also talked about if we have changed, the North Koreans also must have changed, because exchanges cannot be unidirectional. Changes happening is just a matter of degree. And many of them also talked about non-political nature of the exchanges. They deliberately avoided contentious issues as imagined by South Korean government. And some of them talked about obstacle against exchanges, communication barriers. Even if they are in a third country, it's very difficult to contact one another. They cannot just email each other. They cannot just send KakaoTalk messages. Legal barriers still, despite all these new laws that facilitate inter-Korean exchanges. Recently, sanctions, in the past too, but current sanctions are quite harsh. And exchanges depend too much on political atmosphere between the two Koreas, especially when we have conservative governments in South Korea. So this also came up in our interviews. And this, we don't know too much about this, but it seemed to us that the exchanges were happening mostly between males. This is just an observation. We tried to confirm this from Ministry of Unification. We asked for gender statistics because they must have it. They approve who is going there, so they must have all the statistics, but we couldn't get it. But it's our understanding that the exchanges were quite gendered, happening mostly between males. Okay, thank you very much. Looking forward to your feedback.
고맙습니다.
Thank you very much.
두 번째는 문경.
We will go on to the next presentation. It is a pleasure to meet you. As was introduced, I am Hyunyun Moon from Jeonbuk University. And the area that I mostly study is development and cooperation with North Korea. I will briefly explain. And I will try to be slow because I understand there is interpretation being provided. If I am not aware of my pace, I tend to speak very fast, and that is why I will try to speak in a steady, slow pace. The area that I study is development and cooperation with North Korea. In addition to that, international development cooperation is an area of my study. And with Tae-hee Kim, I have been studying international cooperation for a long time. And I am a research head at the International Development Cooperation Society. The advantage of studying these two areas, but if I talk about the difficulties first, it's very tough and I might not have depth because I am looking at international development cooperation and North Korea at the same time, so there might be less of a depth. But if there are some difficulties in studying North Korea, I can find the solutions to it from international development cooperation. And I think because of those reasons, I have been studying these two areas at the same time continuously. So today I will be presenting on development and peace nexus and North Korea's internationalization. Those who study North Korean issues talk about this a lot. From 2015 with the SDGs, international society talks about peace, humanitarian development, and peace nexus. So we talk about HDP nexus frequently these days. So in the international development cooperation led by KOICA, in this area too, we talk about HDP and Nexus, and we are trying to deliver our message in this area. And I took out humanitarian in my title. I talk about development peace nexus. From 2004, we have tried to put on the humanitarian side, and North Korea is trying to focus on development. And on the Korean Peninsula, the Korean government has a major agenda on peace. So it seems that for the humanitarian situation, there have been some improvements. And if we go on to denuclearization, we need to, in the next phase, think about development and peace to create a synergy. And there needs to be study in this area. There needs to be active study in this area of linking peace and development. Of course, we do need humanitarian aid in North Korea, but these days the discussion is focused on development and peace. And it has become a major issue these days and a major agenda point. That is why I want to focus my attention on development and peace more. And so the background of my paper is as follows. With the denuclearization negotiations, if this negotiation is striked, so development aid, including humanitarian aid and economic aid activities may be possible. During the past 3 years, however, the denuclearization issue and negotiations around that seem to be on the verge of being reached, but it never really was not really realized. And so humanitarian aid even, let alone economic and development aid, has been halted. And so amidst such a Korean Peninsula situation, if we shift gears to international cooperation, development cooperation, what is being discussed there is that for development and for growth, it is important, it is critical to lay peace. And that is what is happening on the Korean Peninsula. Peace is a precondition for development, but international society centered around the United Nations is talking about the opposite side too. Without development, without growth, peace is difficult at the same time. So what is first, development or peace? Is development first, and does peace follow, or peace first and development follow? Now they are saying that it is more organic than that. It has to come together. Korean government, so we're pursuing denuclearization, and then only after that, development discussions and aid can be possible. That is true, but for us to lay peace, humanitarian aid and development cooperation is also very important for peace. And through international development cooperation, we can gain some implications. And in that sense, I set the title of my presentation to be Internationalization of North Korea. So in 2016, North Korea. So it's a strategic framework for cooperation between the United Nations and the DPRK. So there is this strategic framework. So this is a strategic framework for cooperation between the United Nations and DPRK. So this document that was adopted in 2016 that applies from 2017 to 2021, according to the study of this document in North Korea, it seems that as a member of the international society, North Korea is trying to become a member of international society. They're trying to meet the conditions to become an international society member. And the international society should support them so that they can meet these conditions. And that is one of the results or the outcomes of this framework. And the reason why we can come to this conclusion is because this document does not just come out from nothing. There was a strategic framework for the cooperation between UN and DPRK. That's the second. There was the first and the second. So we are now in the 2017 to 21, which is the third, a strategic framework. And it's not just a document that lists the budget. In the document that was adopted in 2017, which is UNSF. Now, it is about how North Korea will participate in dialogue and what type of entity or country it will become is described ambitiously and boldly. That is why I believe that DPRK is trying to establish an image of a normal state. It might be fake, but still, it's trying to portray itself as a normal state. Then I would like to talk about the key characteristics of the strategic framework. And unlike previous documents, it first of all lists the priorities such as food and nutrition security, social development service, resilience and sustainability, data and development management. It lists the 4 priority areas. In implementing these 4 priorities, it talks about how North Korea will implement these the priorities. UN organizations signed this document, and many donor countries discussed this document together. And in the preface of this document, NGOs also are mentioned. In implementing the strategic framework, it says that not only the 13 United Nations organizations that have signed this document will be working on this, but they will also be working with various international actors, including NGOs. And in the third strategic framework for cooperation between UN and DPRK, which lasts until 2021, this third strategic framework is different from the previous frameworks, and it is because it has the programming principles. The programming principles are standards and platforms, and so this document includes these principles. During the morning session, I said that it might not be possible to share my screen with you, but I will try to do that. If you take a look in this document, the part that I focused the most on were these 7 programming principles that sustainable development goals will be applied, a human rights-based approach will be adopted, gender equality and the empowerment of women will be supported, environmental sustainability will be pursued, and environmental and institutional sustainability will be pursued, resilience will be strengthened, and result-based management management will be applied. These principles were areas that North Korea resisted in the past, but they have included the programming principle this time around, and it shows that North Korea is trying to change its attitude, is my reading on this. And as we have exchange and as we cooperate with North Korea, one of those principles mentioned is the result-based management. One thing that North Korea was resistant against was monitoring and evaluation. And one thing that they did sign, North Korea signed and agreed to, was that there will be monitoring of the results because it will utilize result-based management. So the result-based assessment and the monitoring will be done. And North Korea even added in the wording that they will like to receive support from international society to enable such monitoring. And as North Korea carries out UNSF, they said that they will work on cooperating, and they focused on strengthening capacity, and it also says that it needs this. And when I was reading this document, one thing that I read from it, maybe others might beg to differ, but this was made in 2015 through various discussions, and it was adopted in 2016. And as a researcher, I feel that from 2015, in a low level or on its own level, it was trying to carry out efforts to become a normal country. And it was trying to portray an image that it is a normal country. It might just be a rhetoric from North Korea, but it seemed that they had very bold discussions in 2015 and adopted this in 2016. It was 2 to 3 years prior to negotiations and discussions for denuclearization. So I think that already from 2015 to 16, they started efforts to become a normal country. This is my personal, very cautious read and take on this. We have Professor Kim, and Professor Kim Tae-gyu stated that from 2016, North Korea, according to the labor newspaper, talked about SDG. They included SDG in the wording in the labor newspaper, and there was a study of how frequently it was mentioned. Since 2016, SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, this was mentioned in the labor newspaper, and this message was conveyed. And I think that this might be related to what I wrote in my paper, that around this time, North Korea had the will and interest in becoming a normal country. Then international society, including South Korea, on this will or intention of North Korea, how can we support them? If North Korea becomes internationalized, will it be disadvantageous to South Korea's plans for peace? And will it strengthen the control over North Koreans? Will it help? Or will it help? So in the latter part of my paper, I talk about UNESCO Korea office since it was established in South Korea after the Korean War, and the activities that UNESCO carried out in Korea in developing Korea, Korea's social, education, and economic development, how UNESCO helped. And as Korea developed itself into a healthy member of the international society, what UNESCO contributed to is discussed. And I participated in that evaluation. And I looked at the UNESCO Korea office programs. Looking at those programs, I felt that if these programs are implemented in North Korea, and if UNESCO Korea office it cooperates with North Korea to carry out similar projects in North Korea, then this can work to help in internationalizing North Korea. It can contribute to that, and North Korea's internationalization will help it to abide by the international agenda, such as norms and principles of international society. And ultimately, this is the type of peace that we want. We can't just say that denuclearization is peace, we need to help North Korea to grow and to develop itself into a healthy international society member, and various support and aid can be provided so North Korea can build up its capacity to become what it aims to become, a member of international society. And going on to my very last slide, if you take a look, this shows the various activities that the UNESCO Korea office programs that were carried out since the Korean War. And you will see the activities that are carried out up to now. You will see it on the left-hand side. And if these programs are implemented in North Korea, and if this can help in internationalization of North Korea, it will be desirable to connect it with North Korea. And already, for some of the programs, already North Korea is participating, and UNESCO Korea office, South Korea office, is trying to carry out these programs in North Korea, but due to the stalemate in the denuclearization talks, the discussions for carrying this out in North Korea have been halted. And these programs, right now, they have been stopped. They have been shut down due to denuclearization negotiations not progressing. Of course, these programs cannot be implemented at the moment, but if we can at least try to implement some of them earlier than later, then it can contribute in establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula, and that is the key point of my presentation today. That will be the end. Thank you for listening.
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much.
So now we're going to hear the third presentation of this session. Dr. Chung will be presenting. Good afternoon. I am going to present on behalf of Dr. Young-hoon Song. I am from the same institute as Dr. Song. My name is Hyun-suk Chung. Dr. Song was originally planning to attend himself, and he tried to reschedule some of his engagements to make sure that he could come, but due to some urgent matters at the school, he was not able to attend. So he sent his apologies to all the participants here. So that said, I would like to present. Dr. Song prepared a presentation on the inter-Korean border area cooperation and peaceful use of the DMZ area. So there have been summits between, Korea and North Korea, and also between North Korea and U.S. But the Hanoi summit ended up in a failure, and we have not been achieved significant results. And one of the significant development, however, is the Northern East Sea Railway project. And more recently, some of the local governments have been designated as potential partners to get involved in cooperation projects between the two Koreas. The U.S. Trump administration still has negative view of improvements of relations between the two Koreas, and they're concerned about the inter-Korean cooperation progressing without improvement of U.S. DPRK relations. And so we really need to have a strong political will to carry forward despite such negative views from the U.S. And the Korean government needs to be able to create very specific policies and create a forum and platform where these policies can be tested. And in order to evaluate the effectiveness of such policies, it's very important to utilize DMZ. So DMZ has garnered a lot of scholastic and also policy interest. And the policies, however, thus far have not really taken into account the specific characteristics of the DMZ effectively. And many of the policy initiatives that were designed have not resulted in real change for the local community members on either side of the DMZ. And oftentimes, the local residents and their interests have been pretty much objectified in the pursuit of policies. And also, there's been a mismatch between the natural and human and ecological maps, and the mismatches need to be taken into account in the policies. But that hasn't happened. And also, because the Gangwon province has become a huge electoral district with different political views, it's very difficult to establish a representation that is really true to the political views of the residents there. And also, because the border areas, due to military security issues, the information about these zones are very limited. It's very difficult to set policies that are more informed. And also, but if we could expand the concept of border area to include such things as iron-wired fences along the coast of East Sea and West Sea, then we can see how that limits the fishing activities and also limits the access to natural environment, which impacts the lives of the residents. And when the Cheongdongjin and Simgok port seaways were connected, and thereby removing the limitations and restrictions posed by the wired fences, new opportunities arose in this area. So I think it is important to consider the impact of using the concept of border area in a broader sense. And we need to reevaluate perceptions of the DMZ. DMZ should not be seen as something that is very uniform. In Germany, there's Grünes Wand, and there have been many efforts on the part of Korea to benchmark this Grünes Wand model to develop an ecological peace park in the DMZ, but we have not come up with any concrete measures, and we have not really furthered the discussion effectively. So we really need to come up with solutions, alternatives to remove the practical obstacles. DMZ is a space where a lot of destruction has continued due to military and security reasons, and it is a place where there is a new ecological environment that has formed since the division of the Korean Peninsula, and it is a place where development needs to take place in order to have effective cooperation between the two Koreas, and we also need to restore some historical aspects of this region. So how to utilize this DMZ requires that we first confirm its necessity in terms of development, restoration, and preservation. And in order to do this, we need to have accurate spatial information about the DMZ. Next, I would like to talk about the key issues and challenges concerning the cooperation efforts in the border area. As you all know, in the border area, there is no specific projects that's underway. Therefore, we need to have more effective preparation and also relationship building in order to foster cooperation in the future. And cooperation means that there's a partner on the other side. And so cooperation cannot be driven unilaterally by the interest of one party. Moreover, we have been divided for nearly 70 years, and the border area has symbolic significance as a place that represents the history of conflict and confrontation. And so how we can reinterpret this space in order to make this an area of cooperation is very important. And also, we do not have very much information about how North Korea sees and interprets the border area. And because we have been divided for the last 7 decades, there has not been enough research done on the inter-Korean border areas, whereas there is a lot more research done in the DPRK-China border areas. And because there is significant military presence in the border areas on both sides of the 38th parallel, it's very difficult to exchange spatial information and data, but we need to negotiate to understand how North Korea wants to utilize the border areas. And secondly, we need to consider whether some relocation of the military facilities can take place, or whether the cooperation projects that we're pursuing can be conducted regardless of such military relocation. And thirdly, we need to look at who's going to be the key actors and how the financial burden will be shared for these cooperation projects. And since 2018, the local governments in the border areas planned projects that they could work on together with North Korea, but when these direct interactions became impossible, they, in many cases, shifted their plans to improve the road and other infrastructure and maybe set up some museums and hold festivals. And even these require some financial means, and oftentimes the local governments did not have enough budget to carry them out. So financial burden is another issue. Fourthly, the border area cooperation should be designed to also foster the local economy. So through cooperation project, we should be able to achieve some economic benefits on both sides. So we need to strategically think about this. And fifth, the cooperation in the border area should not be seen as a project for restoration of the past, but it should be seen as a way forward into the future based on the present circumstances. And sixth, the cooperation between the two Koreas should be one that can promote the human security of the local residents. Even the cooperation projects, which were designed from economic and political interest, they should, at the end of the day, be able to improve the living conditions of the residents there. And from this perspective, actors of cooperation can pursue different types of projects. So some suggestions. First of all, we could consider development cooperation packages targeted on particular counties. For example, in the North Gangwon Province, Goseong County could be the place for village environment development project. Waterworks, other utilities, communication projects can be pursued, and also various projects to improve the housing could take place, or special crops growing projects can also take place. And secondly, one of the areas where the two Koreas can mutually benefit in the border area is to have cooperation for hydropower generation. There are rivers that run through the Korean Peninsula, and we have had many discussions, oftentimes in the context of flood control and preventing natural disasters. But, we could actually think about these rivers from the perspective of hydropower generation. So if North Korea allows the water from Imnam Dam to be released down to the southern part, then, North Korea generates power, but at the same time, South Korea can expand its power generation using that water. So we could share the benefits from that. That's one example. And thirdly, it is in the interest of both Koreas to expand cooperation in health and disease control in the border area. COVID-19 has showcased how the Korean CDC could significantly control the disease. So maybe using this experience, we could have more cooperation between the two Koreas. And fourth, we need to provide safety services based on disaster management and forecast. And natural disasters they transcend borders. And disasters are risks that are universal and potential to everyone in the world. And this is an important issue for both North and South Korea. And especially the vulnerability of North Korea to disasters can have impact on South Korea. So we need to cooperate in dealing with these disasters. And also, we need to deregulate in the border area for effective cooperation. Now, I would like to talk about some of the key issues and challenges for peaceful utilization of the DMZ. There are 4 things that we need to take into consideration. First, DMZ is an area where some sort of destruction may have to continue due to military reasons. And secondly, there are areas where we need to protect the ecological environment. And thirdly, we need to have development in order to establish better infrastructure for inter-Korea cooperation. And there are areas within the DMZ where we need to make historical and heritage restorations. And so in order to peacefully use this area, we could potentially set up a DMZ management agency that is a public entity. As part of the cooperation project, we could create this kind of an agency that oversees the management of the area spanning 2 kilometers north and south of the military demarcation line. And this agency could oversee various cooperation projects. And secondly, the landmine removal is essential for the peaceful use of the DMZ. There are actually many people suffering from landmine explosions in the border area, so we need to overcome this issue. And thirdly, we need to think about how to create representations of the Cold War and divided nature of Korean Peninsula in this region, because we need to have some representation of the history to keep us remembering the lessons. And we could think of setting up museums, and we need to work with museum curators and also various experts in history, politics, and sociology to develop many programs. And fourthly, we need to have some sort of a space for memorializing the people who suffered during the war. The Korean War was not just a civil war, it was an international war. And we should set up some memorial space honoring the fallen from the U.S. military forces as well as the North Korean and Chinese military forces, so everyone can, move towards a peaceful reconciliation. And fifth, we need to promote and expand the DMZ Road to Peace tourism, it's very important to really engage the public in the process of developing such tourism. And these ideas I have outlined for the use of peaceful use of the DMZ. And so we need to further develop ideas for peaceful use of the DMZ. We need wisdom from everyone in the community. But unfortunately, we have limited knowledge of the border area and the DMZ. Because of military security issues, there is not enough information about the border area shared with the civilians. And we need to have major research and investigation to gather more spatial information in the DMZ. And if we can continue with these endeavors, we will be able to open the border areas for greater cooperation. And although there is international sanction against North Korea, we really need to make efforts to make cooperation possible. If we just wait for the perfect time and perfect opportunity to pursue cooperation, that opportunity probably will not come. So we really need to act proactively to make this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We heard the presentations of the three speakers. Professor Kadru talked about people-to-people exchange and the meaning of people-to-people exchange. There are limitations to North Korea's regime, but also there have been changes to the Korean administration, and this has influenced people-to-people exchange. Despite that, humans are all alike. The language and culture, and also the fact that we are of the same nationality, we should be able to find commonalities. And Professor Moon said that from 2016 at least, North Korea has tried to pursue internationalization and attempted to become a normal country. And he gave some cautious forecasts on that. And then Professor Song and Dr. Chung, who presented on behalf of Professor Song, made various suggestions for the Korean government and the academia, and also to the international society. And the role of the central government was a focal point in the explanation. Inter-Korean relations and the acceptance of UN strategy in North Korea, and North Korea's strategic purpose and the role of local governments were discussed. These are different topics, yet I think that these topics under the triple nexus can be discussed together. So we have Dr. Che and Professor Cho and Professor Kim. They will be providing their discussions in that order. Can you hear me? I would like to thank the three speakers for their presentations, and I would like to ask the three presenters questions. For Professor Moon, you talked about internationalization of North Korea and development and peace nexus, and you talked about the changes in North Korea's attitude and UNESCO Korea office's activities that can take place in North Korea. I would like to know a little bit more about one area, so I'm going to ask you about that. First, North Korea, the human rights-based approach that North Korea understands, what is that? So what is the human rights-based approach that North Korea is willing to accept? Because North Korea is not against the human rights system in UN. They are also upholding UPR and the child's rights on the Accord of the rights for the children. Since 1996, they have sent 5 reports. But the United Nations human rights-based approach, what is that level, and what are they pursuing in terms of the goals? And human-centered, or is it more focused on the vulnerable? Is that the level of human rights-based approach, or are they working on enhancing welfare and enhancing and upholding human rights? So what is the HRBA that North Korea is considering? And second, on UNESCO's North Korean projects, you explained that, and you also proposed some programs. And I think that if these programs are implemented, they will have a broad-ranging influence. And the program items, I want to know how far they have been progressed, but you actually explained that in your presentation, so I don't think this might be an appropriate question. On the programs that have been carried out by UNESCO Korea office. Were there some that were impressive? If you can explain that. And next question to Professor Ian on the people-to-people diplomacy. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think that it was very important and timely. I myself also think that North and South need to make efforts to meet one another, to increase understanding of one another, and it can narrow the gap. It will be a great momentum in narrowing the gap. And on the content of your presentation, I agree fully, but on the methodology and on the strategy, how can it be done? You did provide us with a lot of information through your slides and social and cultural ways that North and South can meet. There are many ways, I believe. And what were the most appropriate ones? And in what social and cultural ways can the two Koreas meet one another? If you can give us some concrete examples. And the social and cultural ways of meeting. Are you emphasizing the government level meetings, or are you trying to underline the importance of civil society? And in Korea, we put importance on the separated families reunions. So I want to know the level of the ways to meet and the targets. Lastly, for Dr. Chung. You gave the presentation on behalf of Professor Song, and I will just ask one question. You proposed many programs on peaceful usage of DMZ. They are all important, and I hope that they can all be realized. However, in the process of promoting this, what is the desire, priority, and voices of North Korea? Did you consider the desires and voices of North Korea, and what approaches do you think will be effective in applying the voice of North Korea? And if you can provide an answer for us, that will be very much appreciated. And that's the end of my discussion.
네.
Next, Professor Cho. Good afternoon. I am from the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies Law School. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important session. I would like to thank the SNU, IPUS, for this invitation. I listened to the three presentations with great interest. These three presentations were very relevant to the broader topic of the session, but as individual presentations, they touched upon different aspects. So I would like to provide some comments and questions for the three presenters. So there are certain overlapping comments with Dr. Che, but I would like to try to remove those overlapping aspects. But a question to Dr. Ihan. You talked about the people-to-people diplomacy, and you focused on the social and cultural exchanges, and you provided some theoretical framework. And you suggested that such people-to-people diplomacy are non-political and non-ideological, and therefore it will be very helpful in improving the relations between the two Koreas. I agree to that, but at the same time, I think there are some realistic limitations. So, we do need to have some, I guess, more concrete approaches. As Dr. Ihan mentioned, there are certain challenges that limit our communication and exchange. There may be some cultural differences, and also the Kaesong industrial complex has been closed. Because of the COVID-19, North Korea, despite the disaster situation, rejected aid coming in. So given the current environment, it's not just because of the sanctions or U.S. pressure. North Korea itself feels uncomfortable receiving the international aid. So even if we are making offers that are, very positive, but North Korea may be very reluctant to receive. So in such a situation, how can we persuade North Korea to come on board? And are there ideas for more effective cooperation between the two Koreas? So if you have some concrete ideas to share, that would be appreciated. And Dr. Moon's presentation was very interesting to me. So this session's broad topic is HDP Nexus, and Dr. Moon's, in many ways, was very relevant to the HDP Nexus. Despite that, Dr. Moon said that he did not include the humanitarian aspect as much and focus more on the development and peace aspect of this nexus. But in other contexts, we also say peace, PhD. So you excluded humanitarian, but also there is the human security aspect, which was touched upon in the third presentation. And during Dr. Moon's presentation, you talked about human rights-based approach. So you removed the H from this HDP nexus in your presentation, but when you're talking about development and peace, you had to mention human rights, and you did. So if look at this from a narrow perspective, humanitarian development peace are very interrelated, even if we interpret peace in a very limited sense. So even though you removed the H, as you said, you did touch upon human rights. And the relationship between PhD, I think is something that you could touch upon, although it's not something that can be clearly delineated. The UN's actually, if you look at the UN development objectives, it's peace, development, and also there is a focus on environment. So SDG is probably the concept that overarches all of this. There is peace, there is human rights, there is development, humanitarian, and also environmental protection is covered in SDGs. So as a comprehensive framework, I think SDG is very relevant. So the UN strategic framework for DPRK it was explained by Dr. Moon very effectively. In the UN human rights regime, in regards to COVID-19, they are analyzing the recent situation from a human rights perspective, and they've released reports. And DPRK has been pretty positive on SDGs. And there's this UN strategic framework, which is embraced by DPRK. And within this, how can we marry the humanitarian aspect and the development aspect and the peace aspect? So I know you did a very good presentation already, but could you elaborate on this further? And Dr. Song and Dr. Chung, the topic was about inter-Korean border area and how to utilize this in a peaceful manner. And you also covered the local government aspect. So that was very insightful. And I think my comments will overlap with Dr. Choi's already, but you made about 5 proposals in terms of direction and from the and the level of specificity. You have really been extensive, and you talked about the peace park, and you posed various ideas, but oftentimes these ideas need to be prioritized. And more recently, the information exchange about the shared rivers. Because there have been typhoons, and this has poses disaster risks for both North Korea and South Korea. And I think your idea, or Dr. Song's idea, about of proposing this as a potential hydropower generation opportunity and link with that the disaster response potential. I think that's a very good idea. So I think the information exchange about the rivers is very important. It should be on one of the top priorities. And also, you talked about the disease prevention and control effort by South Korea and how experience could be shared with North Korea. I think that's another top priority opportunity. And you also talked about human security. In HDP, so what's the relationship between human security and the HDP nexus? This is a question that also goes to Dr. Chung. As you do research in the DMZ, do you have a big picture of this HDP nexus? And you emphasize the local government, but when it comes to DMZ, it's the UN command that really has oversight. So in order to develop the DMZ area, there needs to be involvement of the international community and their support. So do you have any ideas with regards to getting the international community support such endeavors? Thank you.
마지막 김태
Lastly, Taegyu Kim. Thank you for the three presentations. Professor Cardi is a guru in people-to-people diplomacy, and Professor Moon is also a guru in North Korea development cooperation. And Professor Song could not come, but Dr. Chung gave a wonderful presentation on the border area. I learned a lot too from the presentation. First, on Professor Ayan's presentation. Dr. Che and Dr. Cho talked about this. So I won't ask for concrete policies and examples. But in terms of the theory, I want to ask you this question. You said that perception is mutual, that it is not unilateral, that it is mutually established. Social constructivism, I think you're trying to perceive it there, and you're talking about the establishment of ideas. And how can that be then proved? Inter-Korean exchange, when there is people-to-people exchange, and what is the basis of saying that there is a mutual perception? And theoretically, how can it be proved that there is a mutual perception? So, because I think that if it can contribute in establishing theory, it will be extremely helpful. And also, next to Professor Moon, the presentation was very thorough, so there is not much that I can add. And we had a discussion last week at another meeting, so I don't know if I should say this once again, but what I would like to ask you is this. 2020, the first vice director talked about withdrawal of hostility. So securing security and denuclearization. They don't want to talk about that. There should be security guaranteed, that there should be withdrawal of hostility for them to continue on even with the denuclearization discussion. So they want security guarantee. And We don't know if the Trump administration will be reelected or if there will be a change in the administration in the United States. Well, in that situation, what is South Korea's position? Because if we connect security with humanitarian aid and economic aid, what do we need to emphasize more, peace or economic development? Because they say that they are not going to receive humanitarian aid, and withdrawal of hostility has become a major topic now. So there has to be a card that we need to put on the table to lead to a breakthrough. And second, you talked about the Workers' Party paper, and I received the help of Unification Institute, and they provided me with articles. And from 2012 already, they talked about sustainable development. And DPRK from 2016 to 2020, the 5-year economic development strategy, there they also talk about sustainable development. And they say their economic development is in line with UN Sustainable Development. So it seems that North Korea's diplomacy is becoming multifaceted. So one pillar of it is about the relationship with Washington, but all at the same time, they have been receiving pressure from 2012 that they must have multilateral relations, and that is why it seems that they accepted the strategic framework for cooperation between UN and DPRK, and I think this is connected with your talks on DPRK trying to become a normal country, and is it possible for us to accept this as a diversification of North Korea's diplomacy? In that case, we would have to change our approach too. There is a U.S. and China rivalry, and it's accelerating. In that situation, in the international society, there's a lot of dialogue that China is using to get hegemony, and is North Korea trying to support China? Or is it their unique diversification policy for diplomacy? And on to Dr. Chung, what I would like to ask. This area is an area that it was unfamiliar to me, so I learned a lot. And Professor Cho said this too, that hydropower and disaster management, you gave some proposals on that, and they're great ideas. And what's the relationship with the UN command? And this is our idea. So I am curious about how far have these ideas that can be carried out in the border area have been discussed with North Korea? Is it just our own ideas, or has it been discussed, and is there some progress with North Korea? How far is this possible?
네, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much.
지금 보니까 특별히 그 외부에서
And online chat windows, we don't see any questions there. So now I can give the floor to the presenters to respond to the comments and questions posed by the discussants. Maybe 5 minutes each. So please limit your responses to 5 minutes. First, Dr. Ayhan. 5 minutes, please.
I listened to your questions in Korean, but let me answer them in English. It would be much more efficient. Thank you for all great comments, feedbacks, and your questions. I'll begin with Professor Che and Professor Cho's questions because they were quite similar. Both of you asked me about policy recommendations, but I need to clarify something. My paper was not based on normative ideas. It wasn't policy recommendations. It was, it is an empirical paper. So I didn't really suggest anything. I don't really have any policy recommendations in the paper, or I don't have an agenda that I'm trying to promote. If you ask me personally, which I will come to that, so I might have some suggestions, but they would be speculative. So in this paper, as I said, in the first part, what we do is we try to map the theories of change. What South Korean governments are trying to do with these exchanges. So we look at official documents to understand this theory of change, how they frame it. And second part, so what's happening? So, and this will be also my answer to Professor Kim's question. So the second part, maybe the question is more about a unit of analysis, because we are not really looking at interstate relations. We are not really looking at the systemic level of analysis between the two countries. We are looking at what the post-structural IR theorists call micropolitics or everyday IR. We are looking at what's happening at the individual level of analysis. What is happening during these exchanges? So we try to understand and make sense of their experiences. So, for example, the part about mutuality and exchanges being bilateral is just the perception of South Korean participants. It's probably not even an objective reality. It's just their experiences. It's just how they felt. So we are just trying to make sense of their experiences. And so this all being said, if I am to make some suggestions, which I don't think I can, based on what we have, because we didn't really test any hypothesis. We don't really know whether these would be effective or not. So whatever I say would be just my own opinions. It's just going to be speculative. But first of all, and again, this is related to Professor Kim's question, to move from individual level of analysis to interstate systemic level of analysis, there must be some sort of transfer from micropolitics to macropolitics. And it's not easy in inter-Korean exchanges or through inter-Korean exchanges, because it's happening at a very slow rate with very limited number of people. So usually, if you look at the history of exchanges between adversarial states, it needs to be happening at a massive level, either involving the elites or the mass public. So we can look at, for example, US-Germany, US-Japan after the Second World War. So it needs to be happening at a massive level. So there must be a critical mass to transfer what's happening at the individual level to state level. So it's not happening, and I don't think it will happen anytime soon between two Koreas. And it's also related to Professor Che and Professor Cho's question. There are two sides. So even if South Korea wants to have these exchanges, North Korea often is reluctant. So it's really difficult to have these exchanges. But my 5 cents or 2 cents is that South Korean conservative governments, for example, always emphasize security first, denuclearization first, before we have any kind of people-to-people exchanges. In rhetoric, yes, these exchanges are super important, but there must be denuclearization first, which is unrealistic. And personally, I think this doesn't make sense, because South Korea has nothing to lose. It should be North Korea who shouldn't want these exchanges. South Korea has nothing to lose. And so this is my criticism of conservative policies on this. My criticism on progressive government policies is that the emphasis in these exchanges is always on unification. Even the term, for example, sunshine, is kind of threatening to North Koreans. And this even came up in our interviews. The North Korean participants sometimes talked about, we know what you mean by sunshine. You just want to dominate us. So this kind of rhetoric is threatening to North Korea. If South Korea is serious in these exchanges must emphasize a peaceful coexistence. So just like between any other countries, so between South Korea and Japan, between South Korea and China, it should be about separation or maintenance of separate entities rather than unifying these two entities. So it should be more about diplomacy than about domestic politics. And how can we have more effective people-to-people diplomacy? It should always have positive contact. So contact theory, so social psychology theories have really great sources for this. Contact theory, social identity theory. Actually, as I said, South Korean government also emphasized this in the methods of theory of change. There should be it should be non-competitive, non-contentious, non-political as much as possible. Common goals should be emphasized. For example, collaborative projects like UNESCO projects or sports projects, for example, were found to be much more effective than others in many studies. And accepting each other as they are. So there must be some equal status to participate. So this is already happening, so I don't really have anything to suggest here. But again, another important thing in contact theory, for example, is the importance of interdependence, creating interdependencies rather than dependencies. In people-to-people exchanges, in Kyoseong or in Kaesong or in humanitarian exchanges, dependency is being created between the two countries or between the two societies. Whereas in social and cultural exchanges, it's more interdependent than dependent. So the emphasis, I think, should be on social and cultural exchanges in terms of people-to-people exchanges. But this is just my 2 cents. Thank you.
오케이. 고맙습니다.
Thank you. Next, we will be hearing from Professor Moon. Thank you for the very insightful questions and comments from the 3 discussants. Dr. Che talked about are there any substance to humanitarian aid on rather the human rights-based approach of North Korea. I think that this is for the vulnerable. Yes, it is in a declaration type of format, but if you look at the wording, I was focusing my attention on the fact that North Korea signed to these the language and UPR. They received the 3 UPR and they refused to accept the proposals. And I had the opportunity to see that even there they were more willing to accept on the usage and on the institutions that they will have discussions with United Nations human rights organizations to adopt certain mechanisms. And this shows that there is a change in attitude. And on the human rights-based approach, this itself is more a declarative situation. But if you look at UPR, you can see some similar types of changes. And next, what are some projects carried out by UNESCO? Yes, there are some projects that have been carried out by UNESCO, such as Human and Biosphere Program. So it is a project that involves Mongolia, China, and North Korea, the Northeast Asia Biosphere Protected Area. It is a network program. And the technology and knowledge in this area is exchanged through that program. So it is a program that facilitates meetings and exchanges and learning from one another. It serves as a channel to exchange with one another. And UNESCO, one thing that they can have an impact is on the cultural heritages and natural heritages registration. So the listing. And in those listings, there are some areas that North Korea wants to list as United Nations heritages, and that will lead to a lot of tourism revenue. As you know, Hoi An of Vietnam and another area in Laos or Myanmar, these other areas, they have studies on how being listed as a heritage site, that this led to a great social economic change. And there is a study on this. And North Korea also has some natural heritage sites and cultural heritage sites that they would like to list. And if UNESCO can carry out projects to help them list these areas as a heritage site, this will contribute to social and economic development of North Korea. So there are these big programs, and UNESCO Korea office actually has some programs on helping developing countries to get knowledge on how these developing countries can list their own heritage sites. And so North Korea may participate in these programs where other developing countries are receiving aid from UNESCO Korea office, and this is included in the report. And Professor Kim and Professor Cho asked some questions. First on Dr. Cho's comment. I think we need a certain size of economic development cooperation. The humanitarian situation in North Korea, I think that since 1999, it's in a most serious situation. The food production in 1999 hit bottom, and then it has improved. But in the past years, with the tightened sanctions, we now see that the agricultural yield has gone down, and there were sanctions on agricultural products such as fertilizer. China, they have stopped their support for fertilizers and food aid, and there was the COVID-19. Also, there were many typhoons that hit the Korean Peninsula. So it seems that their food shortage is severe. We don't have the data, but looking at various materials, it seems that the humanitarian situation is in a dire state comparable to other dire times. And then, why did I take out humanitarian issue here? I took out the H from the HDP Nexus because I wanted to simplify this, because we talk about the new economic cooperation, and North Korea also talks about development cooperation. So I wanted to simplify a bit the paper and how there could be synergy between development and peace. And that is why I took out the humanitarian side of the HDP Nexus. However, more than anyone else, I agree that North Korea needs humanitarian aid ever more than other times. But I narrowed the scope in this paper about whether development, cooperation, and exchange can contribute to peace. And I wanted to show that it can lead to peace, and that is why that has been left out. But and that is the reason why I left out the human rights issue as well. And lastly, on Professor Kim's comments and questions. It's a very tough question that you asked. Professor Kim, I am unlike you. I am a development scholar, so I don't know about the details of the political situation and security situations. I look more on the development side. And the comments of Yeojung Kim, one thing that I feel is unfortunate is that U.S. talks about denuclearization first, and only after denuclearization discussions are completed can we talk about exchange and cooperation. So that's what they have been saying, and I hope that Korea can come up with the policies that can lead to a breakthrough, but we have not done that, which is quite unfortunate. We blame it on the working groups and those that are viewing North Korea as a junior scholar myself. One thing that I feel is unfortunate is that we say that our hands are tied due to the sanctions. We had 2 summits, inter-Korean summits and Washington, Pyeongyang summits, yet we have not seen a breakthrough. North Korea have halted many of their tests, and they showed gestures for peace. And what gestures have South Korea have taken? And it seems that we are just looking at Washington and following their stance that denuclearization has to come first. And China said that they will be supporting rice. And looking at that article alone, South Korea says that it supports North Korea, but the level of our support is very meager. It actually is a situation where North Korea requires humanitarian aid, yet they cannot talk about it, and the humanitarian aid that we are willing to give was too small. China says that they will support 800,000 ton, and they need 5 million ton for a year of food, and 20% was supported by China. So it's a large scale that they cannot refuse. But the level that we are suggesting is so meager that it could be possible for North Korea to refuse our humanitarian aid. And with this heightened tension, the gestures that we have proposed are too small for them to accept. So U.S. is saying that they will lead, but if we observe, it seems that North Korea is trying to diversify its diplomacy, and it seems that they're taking their first steps for diversifying their diplomacy. And I am cautious in using the term normal state, but we see some steps toward that direction. And Dr. Kim, like he said, they wanted to break away from the U.S.-oriented diplomacy, and they want to have more multifaceted diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Dr. Hyun-Suk Chung, your responses, please. Well, I'm not sure if I am prepared to give a very good response. I would like to respond in light of Dr. Song's presentations. The history of inter-Korean cooperation, what we can find is that oftentimes our relations have repeatedly continued and then suspended due to military or security issues. So the military, political, and security issues have driven our relations and cooperation. But during the Kim Dae-jung administration and Roh Moo-hyun administration, the political will of the leaders in both Koreas can actually overcome such challenging circumstances in political, security, and military aspects. So right now we are at a stalemate and a standstill, and what we really need in order to break through this the challenging situation is the political will of the leaders in the two Koreas. I think that is the key message Dr. Song wanted to convey. And more recently, one of the changes in the political environment is that the local governments in Korea have been approved as key actors in inter-Korean cooperation projects. So there are 11 local government entities that have been approved as initiators of such cooperation projects. And the Gangwon province and Gyeonggi province are two of those local governments. And these two provinces, for example, Gangwon province, announced that they will pursue 52 inter-Korean projects, including the Kumgang mountain tourism. And also, they have announced that they would like to do some shared agricultural projects in Gangwon province with North Korea. So the local governments are proactively taking the initiative in pursuing cooperation with North Korea. And Gyeonggi provincial government also in August, the governor of Gyeonggi province, Lee Jae-myung, stated that the local governments could really break through the current standstill where international sanctions and state-level relations make things difficult. And also, the facilities for certain project was approved by the overall approval for getting the facilities across to North Korea. And also the COVID-19 response was part of one of the projects that got the go-ahead. And so I actually think the local governments who are actively taking an initiative can achieve a breakthrough, and the political wills of the leaders of these local governments can really make a meaningful difference. And these examples set by these two major provinces in Korea may be replicated and perhaps influence the involvement of other local governments. And also, in Gangwon province, one of the presenters mentioned the package type county level cooperation. This has been inspired by the UN SDGs. The connection is very unstable. So our institute continues to provide advice, and within Gangwon provincial government, again, there are 52 projects that have been shortlisted to be pursued with North Korea, including the sharing of information on the rivers that I mentioned, and also joint response on climate change. So there are a number of projects that are quite meaningful, and these will be promoted as much as possible in the various counties in the Gangwon province. That's the idea. And there's a comprehensive approach. For example, in the case of setting the right infrastructure, there is the Eastern Sea Railway project, and also there is the connection of the Gyeongwon Railway, and also the peace cruise that would connect the various cities of North Korea and South Korea, and also the connection of Yangyang port with an airport in North Korea. So these are some of the projects that have been shortlisted by Gangwon province. And also for the peaceful usage of the DMZ, there are actually 8 rivers that run across the Korean Peninsula. So utilizing these rivers effectively on both sides of the DMZ is part of the project. And also the EEZ usage peacefully, and also the malaria response on a joint basis, and also health cooperation, and salmon farming and trout farming, of course, on a joint basis, and also developing new varieties of potatoes and other crops. And also there is wind power development cooperation. And the Russian PNG can be linked to the Samcheok area in Gangwon province and maybe jointly use this resource. So these are the projects that Gangwon province is in the planning stage or pursuing. And so Goseong, Tongcheong, and Wonsan could be connected, and Cheongjin, Rajin in North Korea, so that we can ultimately even connect all the way to China. So that's the broad vision that Gangwon province has. So that's the approach. And this, as I mentioned before, should not be just limited as an inter-Korean cooperation, but we could actually see this from a bigger regional perspective involving China too, so that there can be a multilateral cooperation, which can also help to overcome political differences. So I think these are important initiatives that initially began from a local government. With regards to approval from the UN Command, well, the interpretation of the role of UN Command and their authority is actually a very sensitive issue politically, and there is no clear consensus. And in Dr. Song's presentation, UN Command's role should have the oversight of maintaining peaceful situation under armistice. But it's a limited role in his view. And when it comes to cooperation between the two Koreas and conducting private tourism projects, immigration and customs that are done in a non-military fashion and purposes should be given to the Korean government's purview. And so in Dr. Song's presentation, I think the approach was to have assigned UN Command a limited, role.
So we have about 10 minutes left for the panel discussion. If you allow, I would like to now ask some questions. This has been discussed, but on Professor Moon's presentation, North Korea, compared to a South Korea-led initiative, would like to work on a multi-party international organization-led development and development strategy cooperation. It seems that North Korea intends to participate in such activities. And it seems that that is why North Korea has intentions to participate in United Nations strategic frameworks for cooperation. And if we look at a presentation provided by Professor Song, in addition to central governments, local governments can play a big role, and this is encouraging. And North Korea, they want to avoid participating in programs led by South Korean government because they are feeling that they are competing. So in that sense, do we need to argue that South Korea needs to take the initiative that we should lead? Wouldn't it be better for us to participate into multilateral programs led by international organizations such as various United Nations agencies? How about such approach like that? Because in the process of North Korea participating in strategic framework for cooperation, they agreed to the programming principles and even the result-based management. And from this, we can see the effectiveness of working with such international organizations. But it seems that the Korean government and the Ministry of Unification's position seems to be that they want to focus on inter-Korean programs and inter-Korean activities. They are considering the Korean government's position more. Does Professor Moon have anything to say to this? Thank you, Professor. Basically, in this heightened conflict situation of Pyeongyang and Washington and Seoul and Pyeongyang, it seems that Korean government wants to lead activities, but realistically, that is not easy. Like you said, Professor, multilateral and multinational organizations should be utilized, realistically speaking, in the interim. And in the international development cooperation projects, it will be easier for North Korea to participate. At this moment, we, of course, want to carry out humanitarian development, peace activities, and what should we do at the moment? Boldly, I also would say that United Nations organizations or specialized international organizations and multilateral organizations have certain platforms that can be used. For example, next year, there is a large-scale international conference on protecting forests, so we can encourage North Korea to participate in that international conference because we are in a situation of heightened tensions. So we need to first of all encourage them to come out for exchange and cooperation. And just as the professor said, an easier option will be multinational organizations. And once we see some progress in the negotiations, we can then carry out inter-Korean programs. And just as Professor Chung said, government should not try to solve all of the issues. Different players can play different roles on different levels and in different areas. The government doesn't have to, just looking at the Korean government, doesn't have to have its hands on everything. It can let other players participate on different levels in different areas, and there can be different opportunities, different channels, and different windows for exchange and dialogue with North Korea. But it seems that the Korean government is just being very cautious about what U.S. thinks, and likewise, South Korea also should identify more projects that it can carry out with the international organizations. It's my understanding that the Korean government and Ministry of Unification is interested in international programs and projects, but not many have materialized. For example, Ministry of Unification invested in UNSCAP, and UNSCAP has invested in certain programs, development programs, and such programs need to be identified even more. We are sitting here, but nobody knows the humanitarian situation in North Korea right now, and that is because the door for cooperation and exchange has been closed. Human rights and economic indexes and humanitarian situations are not being surveyed right now. UNFPA, WFPA, if we are working with them, providing the funding for surveying North Korea's situation, then WFPA will carry out data surveys based on their relationship that they have built up with North Korea. But during the past 10 years, we did not even have that types of situations. Then WFP, did they not want to do that? If they wanted to, if the South Korean government provides funding for studies to be carried out by WFP, then they would have, but that was not done.
So if you have questions for Dr. Ayan or Dr. Chung, or actually the speakers, would you like to make some final comments if you want to, Dr. Ayan and also Dr. Chung? Maybe I'll give you just 1 minute each if you have something to say.
없으시면
If not, we can conclude the session as is. I think Dr. Jo wants to make a comment. Well, with regards to the overall topic, I had a comment, and I was listening to Dr. Moon's presentation and also the other presentations. And so it is very important to take a comprehensive view overall, whether it's development, humanitarian aid, or peace building, or human rights protection. So we need to have a comprehensive view, but at the same time, we need to open platforms where different actors can get involved and engage. And I think it is important to also pursue things in parallel rather than setting something as a prerequisite for the other to follow. So both directly and indirectly, we can engage, and maybe we can get some breakthroughs that can be meaningful. So I was really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you very much for that summary of the session, so to speak. Our nuclear issue here is at a stalemate, but we can't just stay put as is. We need to have different actors acting in their own capacities. And with regards to the Ministry of Unification, perhaps we shouldn't be so stuck on the idea of South Korean government leading the way, because there are different actors that are interested in getting involved, and we should also take into account what North Korea wants and what approach North Korea prefers. So with this, I would like to conclude this session on inclusive partnerships. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.